Yo, just need to translate the song that I sang. It's about which a person, which not a amalgo, thoroughly or this person here, Mr. Wanambi, that represents him, that goes out to the shore looking for oysters from the sea. And, you know, he's been working for 7 years making this exhibition work, and he passed away. We buried him last year, so talks about his spirit still here with us through the song lines. So thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jonathan Binstock. I'm the Vredenberg Director and CEO of the Phillips. Been here for about a month. Pretty much got it all figured out. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Phillips for this afternoon's event, the Wanambi Distinguished Lecture by Dr. Jilda Andrews. Before we go further, I'd like to acknowledge the land of the Piscataway people on which the Phillips stands, and to pay respects to their elders, past and present. This event accompanies a wonderful exhibition currently on view at the Katzen Center at American University called Madayin, 8 Decades of Aboriginal Australian Bark Painting from the Yirrkala, curated by Henry Scarrett, who in 2018 curated an exhibition here at the Phillips called Making the Infinite, Contemporary Women Artists from Aboriginal Australia. Although this exhibition was not from the Kluge-Roo collection, we partnered on hosting an artist who was in that exhibition, Regina Pilawick-Wilson, and her family members, Henry Wilson and Leah Wilson. We partnered with the Kluge-Ruhe collection and hosted them here in Washington. And this partnership led to Regina's mural in the courtyard at the Phillips, which is there today. I hope you get a chance to see it. It's quite stunning. And it then led to their exhibition at Kluge-Ruhe. In addition, I would like to point your attention to 2 out of our 6 memorial poles on view close to the main stairwell when you enter the museum. They're tucked away behind the stairwell and quite stunning. These were gifts to the Phillips by Dennis and Deborah Scholl. For the Phillips, this event is of special importance. It publicly inaugurates our academic partnership with the University of Virginia, Art and Art History Department, and it also celebrates the ongoing cultural diplomacy between the Australian Embassy, Australian Aboriginal and Contemporary artists, and the Phillips Collection. Our partners from UVA made this event happen, and I'd like to thank them for their hard work in this regard, especially Margot Smith, the director of Kluge-Ruhe at the UVA, and Lauren Maupin, manager of education and programs. I'd also like to acknowledge Henry Skerritt, the curator of the Madayin exhibition. And I'd like to thank numerous Phillips team members who put their efforts toward this robust program, including Renee Littleton and her marketing and communications team, Ashley Whitfield, head of public programs, Alani Nelson, community engagement assistant, Emily Conforto, Phillips educator, Frank Cabasso, AV coordinator, and Vesela Stretonovich, director of contemporary art initiatives and academic partnerships, who, in conversation with Henry Skerritt, planted the seeds for this collaboration. And now we will all watch a quick welcome video from Malandiri McCarthy, Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians, followed by a visit to the lectern by the director of Kluge-Ruhe, Margot Smith, who will introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Jilda Andrews. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hello, my name is Malandiri McCarthy. I'm a Yanyuwa Gadigal woman from the Gulf Country in the Northern Territory of Australia. I'm also the Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians. Today, I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra. I also want to acknowledge the lands of the Piscataway, Anacostan and Parmanki peoples, and I pay my respects to your elders past and present. I want to extend that acknowledgement to any Indigenous people in attendance today or online. Thank you for your invitation to present a message at the Wanambi Distinguished Lecture. It is an honour to take part in this inaugural event. And I commend you for commemorating the extraordinary life of Yolngu Elder Mr. Wanambi by naming this inaugural lecture in his honour. Mr. Wanambi was a visionary Yolngu leader, and his passion and dedication to culture, community and art has had a profound global impact. I would also like to congratulate you on the success of Madayin, 8 decades of Aboriginal Australian bark painting from Yirrkala, which has been supported through the Office for the Arts International Cultural Diplomacy Arts Fund, the Australia Council for the Arts, and the Embassy of Australia in Washington, DC. The importance of Madayin and the work of the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection cannot be overstated, and the Australian Government is proud to have supported it since 2009. Yolngu people and culture are deeply interwoven in the fabric of modern Australia through their political advocacy, arts, culture, and self-determination. This 6-year collaboration between the Kluge-Ruhe and Buku Langay Mulka Art Centre marks a new way forward in cross-cultural and institutional collaboration, which centres the voices and perspectives of Indigenous artists through respect and authentic collaboration, and showcases Aboriginal art, culture and history to new and diverse audiences in North America. I hope you all enjoy the next 2 days of events and one day have the opportunity to come here and to visit Yuwaalaraay. Thank you. Bawdyubara.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Senator Malarndirri McCarthy, Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians, for that welcoming message. I'm Margot Smith. I'm Director of Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection of the University of Virginia. And I, too, wish to acknowledge the Anacostan, Piscataway, and Pamunkey peoples and pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, and any Indigenous people who are attending today in person or online. Kluge-Ruhe's been doing land acknowledgement like that for a long time, and I have to say we picked that up from Australians who showed us that first, and it's catching on here in the United States, and it's quite a good thing for people to know whose land they're on. I'd like to thank the Phillips Collection for hosting this inaugural program, especially Director Jonathan Binstock and Vasela Stratnovic, Director of Contemporary Art Initiatives. We're excited to be part of this partnership between UVA and the Phillips Collection. Working together on this event seems to all of us to be an auspicious sign of great things to come. Added to that, we recently learned that the first Phillips UVA predoctoral fellow in modern and contemporary art history is Megan Walsh, who participated in the curation of Beyond Dreamings at Kluge-Ruhe in 2018. So we're excited that we're bringing our institutions together in that way yet again. Today, we kick off 3 extraordinary days of thought-provoking discussion, ceremony, and celebration associated with Mardian, 8 decades of Aboriginal Australian bark painting from Yuwaalaraay, on exhibition at American University Museum through May 14th. We're honored to welcome 8 Yolngu artists, knowledge holders, and cultural practitioners who made the arduous trip from Northeast Arnhem Land to share their art and culture with us. They are Binigar Wirpanda, Goinbi Ganabar, Ishmael Marika, Dunga Maimaru, Damarar Munungar, Milminyina Damarinji, I'm sorry, Milminyina, I have a hard time with that one, Mayatili Marika, and Bulmiri Yunipingu. And we've had such a great pleasure spending the last several days together exploring the area, meeting Piscataway people, going through the collections at the National Museum of the American Indian. It's really been a highlight, and great to get to know you and spend time with you. I greatly appreciate David Wickens, representing Bukularnge Molka Center in Yuwaalaraay, and Cade McDonald from Agency Projects, who've accompanied this delegation and are participating in all of the programs as well. I also want to acknowledge the moderators and panelists who will explore Yolngu art and ideas with members of the delegation during the Mata Ngupani Summit tomorrow at American University. They're Dr. Jilda Andrews from Australian National University, Dr. Jamie Powell from the Hood Museum of Art, Dartmouth, which was the premier venue for Mardian, and Jamie also served as a member of the curatorial team for the exhibition. Dr. Vanessa Russ and Julie Banks from the University of Melbourne, Professor Claire Wright from La Trobe University, Dr. Jessica Hutchins from University of Western Australia, and Dr. Henry Scarrett from the University of Virginia. We're tremendously grateful to our partners and sponsors, especially Bukularnge Molka Center has been a partner in this 7-year project. The National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, the Australian Government Office for the Arts, Australia Council, Australian Capital Equity, the Kerry Stokes Collection, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, Crozier Fine Arts, the Jefferson Trust, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Embassy of Australia, Fondation Alpal, UVA Arts Endowment, UVA Parents Program, UVA Arts Council, and Agency Projects. I also want to thank the University of Melbourne and the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, who were instrumental in bringing First Nations scholars to the USA, enabling them to participate in the Marian programs. These friends understand the significance of projects like Marian, and they were quick to support this ambitious project. Marian is in every aspect a Yolngu project. The idea to create the exhibition that would tell the whole story of Yolngu bark painting was first expressed to us in 2015 by Jamboa Marawili, award-winning artist and Mararpa clan leader. Very quickly, we made it clear to Jamboa and the Yolngu who joined this endeavor that they would need to provide the leadership, the curatorial direction, conduct the research, document and translate statements by artists and knowledge holders, and that we would bring our expertise to the project in what has been a true collaboration. As proud as we are of Marian and its catalog and digital resource, many of us are thinking today about a person who is very special to all of us and who left us too soon to see this project fully realized. Mr. Wanambi served as lead curator for Marian, making his first curatorial trip to Kluge-Ruhe in 2017 with Yanamala Gumana, and returning the next year with Ishmael Marika. During COVID, he worked over Zoom with Marian's curatorial team, with Henry in Charlottesville, Jamie Powell in New Hampshire, and Cade in Melbourne. We can't overestimate his influence on this project in every part of it, from the research and curatorial rationale to the exhibition layout to the education framework. So we're so delighted to name this lecture for Mr. Wanambi and to have this lecture accompany us on the rest of the tour as we go forward. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jilda Andrews. Jilda Andrews is Yuwaalaraay cultural practitioner and museum ethnographer based in Canberra. She draws on her heritage to recognize the cultural ecologies surrounding objects in museum collections. Her focus on material culture and their cultural worlds continues to push the definition of custodianship from one that focuses on the preservation of objects to one that is active in maintaining connections between cultural material and the dynamic systems that produce them. Gilda is a research fellow with the National Museum of Australia and Australian National University, based in the Research School of the Humanities and Arts, and she proudly serves as the co-chair of the Advisory Council for Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection, and we're so delighted she is our co-chair. I had the pleasure of attending a symposium during the Enduring Civilizations exhibition at the British Museum in 2015, where both Dr. Andrews and Mr. Wanambi were speakers. The highlight for Mr. Wanambi was meeting the future King Charles III. The highlight for me was listening to Gilda's presentation about encountering what she called an unhappy box of rocks from her country at the Peabody Museum at Harvard, or in fact, that's what the Harvard staff called the box of rocks. That lecture stuck with me and greatly influenced my ideas in teaching about museums' responsibility to Indigenous peoples. It's therefore fitting that Mr. Wanambi and Dr. Andrews are brought together here again today. Please welcome Dr. Jilda Andrews.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for this very special introduction. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land under which we meet and the people of that land who continue to uphold its beauty and strength. I extend this acknowledgement to other Indigenous, First Nations, Native peoples gathered here today and connecting with this moment over space and time, dialing in and watching the recording. Thank you for meeting me in this moment. Thank you to Senator Malarndirri McCarthy, the Australian Minister for Indigenous Australians, for the video message of warmth and hope, and the invitation to come back to Australia. Thank you to Jonathan Bernstock, Director of the Phillips Collection, for hosting this event, and a very heartfelt and extended thanks to Margot Smith, Director of the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection at the University of Virginia. I'm fortunate to have developed a wonderful relationship with Margot over several years now, which has only deepened over the past year or so in my time on the Kluge-Ruhe Advisory Council. A very special thank you to my newly made Yolngu friends for preparing the ground for us and the words that are to follow. Once again, Yolngu thoughts, ideas and cultural worlds bring people together on a global stage. And these spaces are ready for big ideas, intriguing provocations and questions. It's almost like you've done this before. Certainly, we are made richer by the generosity of spirit displayed today and time again through works like those that grace the walls of the Mādian exhibition and through the voices that bring these works to life, the voices of the past and the voices of today. Your expressions are firmly cemented within the Australian vernacular and indeed provide the framing for my presentation today as I look to the concept of cultural diplomacy in a real and applied sense. In moments like these, and the many moments that preceded this one, and those that are anticipated to follow. We join here at a seat. Sorry, I put too much emphasis on that. We join here at a seat of world power in Washington, DC. Decisions made here have impacted and will continue to impact most people on this earth. The topic of cultural diplomacy is an important one as we continue to make and remake relationships with one another and in our common interest. But essentially, it is about the bridge between the local and the global and the multi-directional representations of the self to the other in the mutual effort to achieve greater understanding. I'm gently guided into this concept by Mr. W. Wanambi, the gentleman who has inspired this lecture and a master of this kind of representation and relationship. I look to his gentleness, his commitment, integrity, and spark to help me think big and to put words to ideas and ideas into action today, in this place. There are many kinds of leadership in this world, and his was of a very special kind. Although I only met him a very small handful of times, he offered me something truly special, and that was his time. There are certain limits to our time with each other, as we know. To be listened to be heard, to have stories shared openly, to share an idea or feeling, these are all gifts of connection, relationships and time, and ones that deepen and take on greater significance with the passing of friends and loved ones. For many of us who have faced loss, however recent or long ago, remembering and revelling within moments shared together are the things that buoy our hope and light our paths, despite the deep and often heavy emotions that accompany. For Mr. Wanambi and for my father, Richard Simpson, I take this opportunity to recognise moments of representation, exchange and connection that have shaped me and continue to inform me and my world and those within. For it is in response to profound acts of severance and loss that connection takes on its greatest power. Today I'm proposing to flip the narrative, to consider historical collections that sit within museums and collecting institutions as sites of Indigenous agency. This is provocative, I think, because it requires a decisive shifting of position that potentially flies in the face of popular public discourse that surrounds the way we think and the way we feel about museums and collections of Indigenous cultural material. It also challenges a suite of assumptions and presumptions around these historical collections and the authorised narratives that accompany them, how they came to be, and indeed, what their destined futures might be. Some may ask why the narrative needs to be flipped. we as a sector and a community have made significant headway with regards to lifting the lid on collections and deepening Indigenous engagement with these collections too. This is all true, and much exciting work has come out of some truly collaborative engagement between Indigenous communities and museums. Exhibitions like Marian are a great testament to collaborative relationships working well under what audiences would believe to be a shared common goal. This is obviously a good thing and something I expect and hope we continue to carry on and do well. Perhaps I'm gesturing towards a greater narrative that needs to be flipped. And that is the story around collections and museums more generally. Contemporary public discourse often frames collections as sites devoid of Indigenous agency, pure products of the colonial project, and wholly without Indigenous voice. This position is also supported within our disciplines, often where a binary is put forward. Museums as dominant and powerful colonial structures, and communities as disempowered sources of things, knowledges and culture. Collections of cultural material, particularly ethnographic collections, sit extremely awkwardly in our contemporary mindsets. We use words like problematic and difficult. We refer to damaging colonial legacies that are still active, and we step towards collections with the presumption that they unequivocally require, in the first instance, decolonising in order to have Indigenous agency restored. It is these assumptions and presumptions that I wish to challenge today. My work with collections shows me in so many ways that Indigenous voices are in fact present in collections. They are creative, multidimensional, and unwavering. They are at times directive and authoritative. Other times they are quiet and almost understated. In whatever ways these voices manifest, I'm inviting us to recognise in the first instance their presence. From that point, we can then see their influence. We may even be able to recognise their power and authority, both before collection and also during their journeys of collection and even beyond. I do not have a doubt that these voices are present in collections and that these voices are expressions of Indigenous agency. Beyond establishing this, let us also consider what these voices are actually saying. I'm hoping to recognise these expressions as a form of cultural diplomacy, expressions that wish to communicate across difference, communicate difference itself, evoke empathy, establish authority, negotiate coexistence, and inaugurate power sharing in ways that speak of particular moments in time and place, or speak to particular moments of time and space. You may wish to think of me as naive here and wonder why I refuse to see the dominating imposed colonial structure enacting multiple waves of erasure. My answer to you is to suggest a naivety on your part, to overlook the fact that in moments of humanness that sit beneath the prevailing political, social and cultural forces that we so readily cite, relationships of exchange were deep, multifaceted and complex, very rarely simple. I refuse to believe that Aboriginal people were mute in these exchanges and that collections were products of domination and one-way exchange only. I'm simply not satisfied in this simplistic belief. These voices are indeed present within collections and the archive, but my provocation today is that we have not been prepared to hear them. Muddying the waters by seeing Indigenous power and agency in sites like museum collections forces us to reconsider how colonisation played out on Australian soil, how we language it, and how complex and very human it must have been. It also forces us to talk with more depth and detail about how Indigenous ideas, thoughts and influences and engagement have also shaped the Australia that we live in today. I'm going to suggest that a proposition like this is as much a part of our program of truth-telling as is the revealing of the scale and devastation of massacres on Australian soil, or the ongoing and extensive implications occurring from the dispossession of people from their lands. Recognising voices of cultural authority within our collections can feel like a radical act. But in doing so, I wish to gesture towards a new relationship that we can have with our collections as sites of and for continuing Indigenous authority, in whatever forms these may take. I also hope that by recognising power and authority in sites like these, we may be empowered by the actions of our ancestors, see strength and foresight in their engagements, and nurture a sense of cultural strength that will lead us to stronger cultural futures. Colonisation was destructive and damaging, but our histories are much longer and richer than the last 250 years. Our story is a much longer one to tell. I feel I must sketch out a bit of my rationale, and I'll use a couple of examples that have motivated me towards this way of thinking. 26 years ago, I began working in, this isn't going to be a biography of me, mind you, just so you know, but 26 years ago, I began working in museums as a marketing and communications trainee. A very interesting pathway into the sector, I know, but an entirely useful one for me at least. I didn't have a curatorial interest, but I knew that the collections of the Australian Museum, where the traineeship was based, were broad, vast, and potentially personal. I found this to be true when touring the collection stalls for the first time with my then mentor, who was based in the anthropology department and had a role of stewardship over the anthropology collections. This was a seminal moment for me, seeing the rows and rows of wood, feathers, fibre, stone and ochre in familiar assemblages, categorised by place. It was also a sensual moment. The air was perfectly still, because it had to be. The air had a smell of the wood, feathers, fibre, stone and ochre, like an old cupboard that had been flung open and the waft hitting you in the face. It sounded like the hum of lights, of flickering of old fluorescent tubes. The thick, heavy air even had a taste. The bruised white gloves previously used by people in the room before us spoke of touch, a mediated touch, and the points of connection that had impressions of the material marked upon them. All of the senses had a control about it, and the senses were mediated. I wrote about this moment for ArtLink magazine in 2017, and I'll recall a passage here. These rooms are overwhelming, confusing, profound and confronting. They are time capsules placing anyone within 1 degree of separation to the moments of intensity we as Australians are yet to fully grasp collectively." End quote. Further on in the article, I reflect upon what this means for those of us being brought into contact with these spaces and the collections. To quote again, "For Indigenous community members who visit or work with museums, these storerooms are places where we confront the past in the present. Cultural material and museum collections are intensely symbolic. These collections represent cultural diversity and sophistication, while simultaneously can be personified as stand-ins for the lives and memories dispossessed and the destructive impact of colonisation." End quote. I think it was the scale of collections making this impact. Within this written piece, I made a direct association between the presence of material in collections, with the absence of material in community. I would go so far as to say I made a correlation between the overabundance of cultural material in collections with the scale of dispossession and dispersal of Aboriginal people off their lands. I made an inference that the act of institutionalising cultural heritage material was akin to the institutionalisation of people through dispossessive acts. This material became stand-ins for people, and the ease at which this inference was accepted, even expected, spoke volumes. People could see what I was inferring and accepted my position. My voice was not alone and may have even influenced others to speak similarly. And I know that this is how I felt back then. The removal of this material from Indigenous people's lives, lifeways and psyche was part of imposed systematic acts of severance of the 19th and 20th centuries. Moreover, upholding these collections and maintaining them today was in some way an acceptance and sustained act of continued severance and severing. It was colonisation again and again, over and over. This is how I felt. This sentiment stayed with me for many years and guided my own research and engagement with collections. As I continued to work with museums, teach about museums, research collections, and work with audiences in narrative-driven display and exhibition projects. It drove my research where I explored more the ideas of objects becoming stand-ins for people or expressions of the scale of change and disruptions to Indigenous lives. Collected objects being understood as part of a diaspora, living off-country. These were interesting concepts and spoke neatly into narratives around repatriation, decolonisation, indigenising the collection or archive, and went part way to considering concepts of an Indigenous museology. But while I developed and explored these ways of relating to collections of cultural material as essentially products of enduring colonisation, I felt a restlessness with it. The stories I was engaging with, the individual objects, the archives that sit behind it, the data, the markings, the so-called ethnographic dirt, these residues of moments of exchange between people called for a closer look and better engagement. The many voices present within these stories were, I felt, demanding to be heard. Of course, collections research reveals things that are not initially apparent. This is the beauty of it, and this is what it's meant to do. When we do collections research, we never get a full story from the object alone. And without the objects, the archive of associated data is understandably incomplete. When these are united, a picture starts to emerge, and the task to refine the picture calls for deeper engagement, again with the objects and the data, seeking out other associated connective threads, and of course reinstating these stories within the context of communities themselves, both in the past and in the present. In the work I do, I love to take an ecological or holistic approach to include country, climatic processes and social organisations of the time. These dimensions can spectacularly bring to life a moment in time as vividly as though we were there. It is sometimes useful to even imagine as though you are actually there, bearing witness, if you like. This can help make sense of decisions and actions made in these historical moments. When we are brought into these moments as though we are there, nuance and insights begin to emerge. And I'll give you an example. Norman Tyndale and Joseph Birdsall were two prominent researchers from the Universities of Adelaide and Harvard, respectively. They undertook extensive ethnographic research across Australia and produced an incredibly extensive archive and collection. In reading about their expedition in 1938 and 1939, I linger at their accounts as they encounter my father's hometown of Walgett, only 9 years before my father was born, mind you. The journals hint on a sense of frustration that the locals were not as cooperative as was initially hoped. They describe this as a lack of enthusiasm for our research. So the team, which also included Tyndale and Birdsall's wives, they were keen to move on to the neighbouring town of Brewarrina, some 83 miles to the west. Rain had set in, though, which made the black soil road near impossible to drive. They described the conditions in their journals as dangerous. I could almost sense and see Tyndale's frustration, even irritation, at being stuck in Walgett for 4 days in the rain, with little hope of engagement from less than cooperative locals. I can even sense the moment he decides to drive at the first sign of the rain easing, risking getting the car stuck in the mud or at least sliding all over the place. After knowing this story for some years, something happened where I gave myself permission to relate. I think it might have been a similar time that my car tyres, caked in mud, span senselessly in the same soil. But with relatability came an empathy, and an empathy that I wasn't expecting. And it was one that I was reluctant to express outwardly. Tyndale's legacy can be particularly stinging. But the greatest expression of empathy, I thought, was that I could see Tyndale as a human here, within a human condition. In the end, I figured that empathy does not have to come at anything else's expense. I can still host complicated feelings about how Tyndale went on to many places to collect many things, including hair samples, stone tools, biometric data, weapons, and detailed measurements of the living bodies of ancestors, as well as other things. Seeing actual people within the frame is helpful. In the case of the Tyndales and Birdsalls marooned in Walgett, I can also clearly sense the frustration and irritation of the locals. As a descendant of one, I can even imagine the facial expressions and the body language. At the persistence of these visiting strangers wanting to know things, probing, relentlessly asking questions, following people around with a truck full of equipment and a clear intent in their actions. To withhold in this case was an act of authority, and one resulting for Tyndale in no data, no collections from the time he spent in this town. Perhaps as a result, there is very little detail of our country in the uniquely colourful map of Aboriginal languages which Tyndale's research later informed. Some 60 years earlier, in 1879, still within the same region, prominent Adelaide figures Catherine and Langlo Parker settled nearby on Bangat Station to run sheep and cattle on a property of around 200,000 acres. Catherine, or Katie as she was known, was deeply interested in Aboriginal people on her property and undertook a kind of amateur ethnographic study on them, collecting many cultural stories, objects, and anecdotes from her time living among them. Katie learnt the Yuwaalaraay language and Yuwaalaraay ways. She later published volumes of Aboriginal legends as well as published accounts of her ethnography. She took on a number of Yuwaalaraay women and girls to undertake domestic duties in the homestead, and she wrote about her life amongst these women. These accounts are obviously difficult to read through today's lens, especially by descendants of women who were also taken in to perform domestic duties for the pastoral station owners. I am one of these descendants. Again, engaging with this archive is terribly difficult. Over time, I think the shock somehow dissipates into other feelings or thoughts, and details emerge from these encounters that were once obscured but for some reason now become visible. Katie planted a huge rose garden in the middle of the bush, surrounding their homestead. I think of it as a possible link back to her home in Adelaide, or the familiarity of the stately gardens that she was often part of. Roses, however, were not originally a part of this landscape, as you can imagine. Unfortunately for everyone at this time, this country experienced an extended period without rain and descended into severe drought. For a station owner running up to an incredible 138,000 sheep and 4,600 head of cattle at its height, this situation is understandably difficult, worrying, unstable, and scary. The Langlo Parkers, while enduring incredibly difficult times like this, themselves directed a scale of ecological change on my country that has transformed it. Not single-handedly, of course, but I carry these feelings when I see and hold the objects that she collected, and I read the stories that she published, even though in both cases these things were made by my ancestors. There is a lot that I lament, but upon reading of Katie's desperation in the midst of this drought, severe drought, I see her focus draw in on her roses. She sees them wilting. She knows that they are about to die. She approaches a clever woman known as Old Buddha several times to ask her to help. This senior, authoritative Aboriginal woman with broad knowledges was believed to be able to work in mysterious and influential ways. It was believed that she could call rain. Katie's approaches were rejected many times, and I think this perhaps cemented her resolve to pursue it. She wrote, and I quote, "Once my garden of roses looked very wilted. I asked Buddha to make rain, but just then she was very offended with Mata," and that was the name that Katie used to refer to her husband in the presence of Aboriginal people. "One of her dogs had been poisoned. She would make no rain on his country. However, at last she said she would make some for me. I bound her to a certain day. The day came, and a heavy storm fell just over my garden, filling the ground tank, which was almost empty. About 2 inches fell. Within half a mile on each side of the garden, the dust was barely laid." In her later life, Katie donated her collection of objects to the University of Sydney at the behest of the Chair of Anthropology, A.P. Elkin. One of these objects was a witch's charm stick. So enamoured by this object, Elkin displayed it in his office. The broader collection later moved to the Australian Institute of Anatomy in Canberra, which then became one of the foundations of the National Historical Collection, now under the stewardship of the National Museum of Australia. Old Buddha's charm stick isn't there alongside the other objects, though. I'm still trying to track it down. But the point I want to make about this scenario was to highlight the relationship between Katie and this clever woman, sharing moments of intense difficulty and change, but experiencing them very differently. I also think about Katie's turn towards the spiritual realm of the Yuwaalaraay people, turning to the authority of Old Buddha and her magic to call rain. This defiant deferment is imprinted on Katie's collection, as is her reliance on Yuwaalaraay people to survive in a very different place at a difficult time. I am, of course, gesturing towards the unseen here, or how contexts, authority and intent abound within the stories of these collected objects, but are perhaps not explicit. This, of course, relies on the notion that objects in collection represent more than simple transactional exchanges, or the movement of objects from one set of hands into another. I'm also illuminating human moments, ones that you and I can see or even feel, but also ones that can become obscured by any number of things, including the present-day lens. I reflect on that learning again, that empathy does not have to come at the expense of other things. I invite you to join me back in that vision of the storage room at the museum, seeing rows and rows of wood, feather, fibres, stone and ochre. How many Katies are here? How many old Buddhas? Only this week I visited collections made by Tyndale and Birdsall from that very expedition I referred to back in June 1938. Objects now housed in the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University. Still complicated, but I came away surprised, feeling a kind of joy, as I was able to see through the feelings I'm supposed to have about Tyndale to strike a tangible connection with people that have gone before and see powerful, sophisticated ancestral knowledges of country translated into objects of material country from my country. Associating feelings of empowerment, enrichment and strength with visits to museums is not the story we're used to reading. To shift a little now to collected objects of more of a deliberate nature, those intended for collections, those imbued with outward-facing messages. These objects are very well represented in the world's great collections, and I'm sure that many of these would be familiar to you. They bear some kind of similar hallmarks. They're often movable, decorated, and involve long-standing and sometimes intergenerational relationships with anthropologists. So they are often associated with extensive archives as well as non-Indigenous advocacy. These are translational objects and offer insights into cultural worlds particularly intended for those who inhabit other cultural worlds. I would love to draw in the canon of Arnhem Land bark paintings as an example, movable forms of cultural knowledge which make their way from one world and into another, shepherded by relationships between knowledge holders and outsiders. They find their platform in their outside world and they work their magic to intrigue and compel the hearts and minds of those who engage. Often through their art world framing, which is of course one of their powerful translational mechanisms, we are invited into what seems like realms of whimsy or otherworldliness, the fantastical creatures, expressive processes of country, the transfixing patterning, the codes, and then there's the story. Not always, but we are sometimes helped towards these messages by story. Very lucky if there's song, dance, ceremony, or other dimensions too. Through the matrix of messaging, we're brought to hover at the edges of our own understandings, and then we're gently met by moments of extreme humanness, empathy, and understanding. The mechanisms behind these objects are a mix of persuasion and incitement, and a willingness for engagement. The intent is to bridge difference and create greater understanding, and I think it's incredibly successful. Look at us all gathered here today in Washington, DC, drawn by the steady hands of Yolngu, past and present, into greater understandings not only of their country and histories, but also of their presences and power. Their messages are otherworldly. They're of scales of time beyond your comprehension. Webs of connections so multidimensional they collapse life forms into spirits and then back again. They are spellbinding because they're rooted both in the past and in the present, and a reiteration of knowledges that are intensely comprehensive and informed by generations of relationships and cultural practice. Time with these are a generous gift. These are beautiful expressions of cultural diplomacy. In the official sense, cultural diplomacy usually occurs between nation states, But in this interesting dynamic, we are seeing cultural diplomacy operating from a local position and selecting peers beyond their domestic neighbours, but well outside of their cultural worlds, to establish national and international partnerships and interest, and with that a multi-directional flow of benefits. Cultural diplomacy within the bark painting tradition is particular to place, of course, but mechanisms of cultural diplomacy can be found across the country and take many forms. I just have to cite the wild diversity of cultures across the Australian continent to help explain why. Before British contact, management of resources and relationships across the continent understandably required high levels of cultural diplomacy and its deft deployment. We are talking about a particular and necessary skill developed and refined over long periods of time, well before the 250 years since British contact. It is an important tool in our toolset, and it always has been. Yuwaalaraay people do not have a bark painting tradition, but we have a particular partiality for song and singing. We're also really good at peer pressure. Very good at that. Our forms of cultural diplomacy may be more present within archives and recordings, and today even on the stage. I might wonder what it might mean to draw more purposefully from Indigenous modes of cultural diplomacy to negotiate domestic scenarios such as land, fire or water management, or the protection of vulnerable or endangered species. It's exciting to think of cultural expressions of authority beyond being narrowly understood as performance or art. But I return again to the deft deployment of this mode of communication and recognise that Indigenous cultural diplomacy is particularly powerful when exercised outside of Australia, on the global stage. It's even recruited by the Australian nation state in international relationship building. My sisters and I have sung for embassies in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Kuwait, East Africa, Cyprus, Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Some of you might even remember our melodic messaging expressed here in Washington DC back in 2016. I can tell you that that deft deployment here in DC must have worked, as it's one of the reasons I found myself back in the collections of the Peabody Museum last week and here today. These expressions are potent, patient, and cumulative. Recognising the strength of Indigenous voices in our collections has sparked some incredible work and innovations in museum anthropology and museum practice more broadly. Some of the work undertaken by my colleagues, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, anthropologists and cultural practitioners, is regenerative and fulfilling. I am stunned and excited by the new approaches that are taken and the new directions our work is going in, and I can see it happening across the world. You might have picked up on my comment that global networks are perhaps more receptive to this work that's being generated on the ground in Australia, and in a sense this is true. The public discourse in Australia surrounding our historic collections, as I stated earlier, has an undertow that is yet to accept the nuance and complexities of our experience and seeks out high-level symbolic atonement. There is still an awful lot of work to do to celebrate Indigenous voices in our collections as authoritative, but the work that needs to be done is now becoming clearer. We've sat with the difficulty of the picture for so long that some of the shock has begun to dissipate into other things, and new views of the same archive are beginning to emerge. Humanness, empathy, exchange, relationships, negotiation and compromise are all rising to the surface, as are other dimensions too, like love, trust and respect. We don't have to diminish our feelings, thoughts or experiences of colonisation and the intensity and force of its destruction to also recognise the very human moments within our history. These are not mutually exclusive. Empathy doesn't have to come at the expense of other things. It is possible to re-envisage our collections as sites of agency and authority, but we can't do it if our receptive senses are so mediated and tempered. Or we can't shine better light on the complexities of our histories and invite people towards it to see what can be revealed. In some ways, I think we might need to create better spaces for Australians to sit with the complexities long enough to move beyond grand symbolic gestures and the enormous scale of the problem to see and hear the patient, potent voices of Indigenous agency that wait to be heard. This is not just about truth-telling, but also truth listening. And it is heavy and complicated. But on the other side is knowledge, insight, nuance, and relationships. I hope that today I've been provocative enough to engage you and persuasive enough for you to consider what I've put forward. At the very least, take this as an invitation to look differently at our cultural expressions and material, and even at our collections for expressions of Indigenous agency, and to come together to do this purposefully. This act is not to deny the scale of destruction forged by colonisation, but to actively restore and repair. For it is in response to profound acts of severance and loss that connection takes on its greatest power. Thank you. Thank you. I'm really happy to take any questions if there are any, or comments. Down the front here. There are microphones, so.
Thank you, Gilda. Is that working?
Oh, the light's on, so yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
working?
Yeah.
Hold it a little closer, maybe.
Okay. Gilda, thank you. That was wonderful and very provocative and thought-provoking. And I love your expression at the end there about truth listening as well as truth telling. I want to ask two of the examples that you gave about rereading material collections and listening to the voices that are patiently waiting to be heard. You used documentary archival sources of white people as a way to reframe the material collections to read Indigenous agency into them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what the importance of the colonial written archive is to this work of repositioning, re-listening to the archive in a different way.
It's a really great question, thank you. That documentary archive is incredibly important because within that you see the handwriting, you see the expressions, you see the sketches, and you're invited into understanding the humanness that's sitting beneath the acts of collecting or research, anthropological research. And, you know, I've become very used to engaging with these, with the documentary archive. And I understand, like, it's really critically important to have that alongside the objects to make a better sense. And, you know, I can take your point here about, you know, about privileging the non-Indigenous documentary archive in order to make sense of these. And, you know, this was a troubling thing for me for a long time, that I only really had these journals and these written expressions from one side of the story. And, you know, in thinking through this as a problem, like thinking of it as a problem, what position does this put me in? It puts me in a position to continue to privilege their side. What's going on there? But I I recognise that within our communities today, within, people today and the relationships and the way we operate today as Aboriginal people, that we are ourselves an ongoing documentary archive of, the community of our ancestors and the people that have gone before. And so it was a funny thing for me to think about that Tyndale moment of when they were marooned, because I kind of thought, I can absolutely imagine people's, even their body language or their facial expressions, because I have a version of that today, in the way that I relate to my family. And I understand those moments just because I'm able to kind of trust that I'm a continuation of the people that have gone before. But I mean, we're talking about a very particular example here of, a moment from my country where I can apply my own personal lens to kind of flesh out and think differently about. I mean, it's almost like an equivalence, a documentary equivalence that I can kind of see within myself. So I think it's really important to trust and invite, of course, communities that are associated with these collections and these archives, and to allow for contemporary responses to these moments, almost in a way that is a recursive gesture towards the historical moment as well. But I mean, I guess we're essentially making and remaking these relationships again. But, I did at one stage wonder and worry about there not being an equivalence of, documentary expression. But it's just how that moment played out, and that's okay. And I'm not seeking to redress that in any way, but rather, I just kind of love to return back to the human bit and the relationship bit. So, yeah, thanks.
I have a mic coming to you on this side, sir.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm many years removed from my education in Australia. One of the things that I've asked myself, many times, is the level of understanding of Aboriginal culture in Australia, and in what you talked about in terms of relationships to the exhibitions and things, whether more is being done these days in Australia in terms of education of younger people to understand the types of thoughts that you're talking about and the history, which is vital to the country.
Yep. That's a really great question too, thank you. I think I'm also able to perhaps approach an answer through the lens of my children who are in primary school or just starting high school back home. And absolutely, I think it's a changed space. My kids come home with already a changed vernacular around even acknowledging country in the way that they do at school. This was never practiced when I was going through school, and I don't imagine either that would have been part of your experience of education at school in Australia either. So I think, through changes like that, what has actually emerged is a permission for students and for Australians more broadly and the community to be able to recognise a belonging in place, in country, on Australian soil. And, we have these mechanisms like, country, acknowledging country, welcomes to country, this shared language that actually is serving to not only reunite Australians across the continent, but also connect them into a particular way of, an Indigenous way of understanding and relating to land. So through this unifying kind of country as a unifying mechanism, I think that's opened the door to, you see it in the syllabus in really imaginative ways. You see it in science syllabus and in maths and in STEM and, engineering, and it's through the humanities as well. So I think that really, that's been a long path, a long journey to kind of get establish that as a normal, as a recognisable thing within the Australian vernacular. But certainly it's opened this fantastic door. And so it's more than Australian students getting a better understanding of Australian history. It's become more than that. It's also about inviting Australians into the landscape. That's not an alarm, is it? No, okay. Sorry, that was an effective pause, wasn't it? Inviting Australians into the landscape so they can also take a position within it. So I think that kind of change was perhaps not unintended, but I think it's been a fantastic outcome of this kind of thing. Yeah, it's going well. It's going well.
I think I might be your last question, Gilda. It's Vanessa Russ right at the back here.
Oh, I can see you.
Hello.
Yes, hello.
I thought it would be really interesting to explore a bit about agency, because I think the exhibition itself is, to me, about an Aboriginal mob actually making paintings of country, of story, of ceremony that they wanted to produce. And I think there's an active agency that we often ignore when we talk about archives and collections.
Mm-hmm.
We often say that there was no agency. And I just kind of thought this audience might be interested in the fact that there was agency, and that our ancestors before us did make choices and decisions about how they lived in the world. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Yes, I think one word that I didn't use in this, which I kind of hoped to get to, was, if we're willing to overlook that agency in order to, apply perhaps more generalist, simplistic views on collections and museums, that word is about undermining. I think if we do that, we would tend to undermine any of the agency or authority of people that have gone before us. And I think that's important. I think this word is important because this word relates to our actions today, that we are potentially undermining the authority and the agency that has gone before. So we are active within this moment. We can make choices on how we language, how we apply our thoughts around colonisation and decolonisation and all of these other dimensions to historic collections as well. So, taking your point too, I think really this is all of our work as much as it is, people that are either working within collections or working specifically, in anthropology or other related disciplines, that actually it also comes down to the expectations of the public that come to visit these exhibitions as well. And I think that's really good because we're empowering visitors then to be able to engage deeper, ask other questions and look for other things. Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question.
There are no more one last questions. Oh, yeah, there's one.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed your lecture.
Thank you.
My question is about how we take this work and do it within the communities. It's one thing to be in spaces like Hanover and Washington, D.C., but what can we do, and how do we make this movement something that happens also within communities directly without constantly asking them to leave to come to us?
Yeah, this is also a really good question, and actually something that's really struck me in my work is that communities are already thinking in this way. Lots of communities are already thinking in this way, that they see their agency, they see their ancestors or their, people, that they recognise these works and they understand the whole kind of cultural world or machinations behind them. And so, in a way, we could, our engagements back in communities are also really important for us to learn from them about what their expectations are of us in doing this work, and to not suppose that these broad frames of museum bad, community good is, like with the communities are wanting deeper engagement too, obviously. And, once the middle ground people come to kind of better navigate this, then we set the scene differently, we host the spaces differently, we kind of, our actions end up kind of having this resonance in ways that affect the way we do our research work and our community work as well. So, it's kind of a bit of an answer to your question, but I think being community-led and community-driven, we have to really be open to that and throw the authority to them to guide the way that we do our work so that we can work more effectively within that middle ground. I didn't really answer your question, I'm sorry. I flipped it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilda. What an astonishing talk. I have learned so much, and I just love the way that we ended with that question, talking about, how we're working together and the outcomes too that are what communities want for themselves, like the Marian catalog in Yangumata in English. It's a document for the many generations to come of the work that Yolngu did on this project. And so we have plenty more to do this weekend. First of all, if you want to share this lecture with others, you can go to Kluge Rue's YouTube channel, and it will be there, if not immediately, in the coming days. We also are offering a ceremonial performance tonight at American University Museum beginning at 6 p.m. And please bring your vaccination, evidence of vaccination. And then tomorrow, the Mata Yungpanmi Summit from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. at the Abramson Family Recital Hall at AU at the Katzen Art Center, and that's just across the hall from the museum. The museum will open at 11, or I think at 11 for people to come in, and we'll have food throughout the day. That will also be live streamed. I just want to thank the Phillips Collection again for hosting this wonderful talk, to the Kluge Rue staff, to all of our friends who are here today. We'll give a lot more thank yous tonight at the ceremony, and to our Yolngu guests and all of our speakers who are with us this weekend. Thank you again, Gilda. One more round of applause, please, for Gilda.